everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Den of Sin, a movie podcast with Devin and James. This is our third episode in. We're very excited. This week we're going to do something a little different. Instead of talking about a specific actor or a specific director's work, we're going to talk about a whole year of film. And oh boy, Devin chose an amazing year. A year that caught, I think, both of us by surprise by the sheer amount of amazing films that came out in this single year. Do you want to go ahead and talk about that year, Devin?
We're talking about 1980.
1980.
So, yes, which we were both alive and breathing through.
Surprisingly. What made you, was this just a movie, or a year of film that you just chose at random? Did you just pull it straight out of your old keister? Or was there like something about this year specifically that you already knew and wanted to talk about?
Well, a couple of movies that came out in 1980 have already been kind of publicly celebrating 40th anniversaries. And,
that's true, yeah.
And so that kind of caught my attention, like, wow, can't believe those came out the same year. And then doing the De Palma episode last week, I was reminded that this was also the year that Dress to Kill came out. Yeah, Dress to Kill came out in 1980. And I was like, oh my God, all these movies came out in 1980. Well, we're never going to get to celebrate their 40th anniversary again. And who knows if we'll be on the air for their 50th.
Exactly.
So let's go ahead and talk about how great 1980 was. It's also known, by the way, to film fans as the year that somehow Ordinary People beat Raging Bull at the Oscars.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that was going to get brought up. I got to say, when you proposed it, even without looking at the list, I was excited because I think this is the most exciting time in American film history, which is the 70s are an exciting period for film, obviously. It's a sort of lot of groundbreaking films and filmmakers came out of this period. The 70s were a reaction to the sort of glamour era of Hollywood, 30s to, the late 60s as far as the kind of content, the kind of films they were making, what was popular. And then the 70s sort of came out with a more, personal, sort of more human side of film. Like I said, a lot of independent filmmakers getting their start. But then you go into so you still have those films. You still have those filmmakers are still working. But then into the late 70s and early 80s, you start to have the blockbusters. You start to have those films that sort of create the modern idea of film spectacles, huge audience viewed blockbuster cinema. Movies like Jaws and, obviously the Star Wars films and everything. But it's just, I think it's, and then in the 80s, which I think are it's the height of pop cinema, where there was just so many, year to year, there were just so many amazing movies that are popular, groundbreaking, still to this day beloved movies. Movies that are actually being consistently remade because they were so good, and we've run out of ideas apparently. But it's always been interesting that you still have, like I said, by 1980 you still have a lot of that 70s vibe going on. Movies we'll talk about, I'm sure, on this list by more, I will say, cutting edge or more artistically minded directors, without sounding too pretentious about it. But then you also have big popular films, big money making films. And exciting movies. That's the thing and if you look at this list of films comprehensively, there are a ton of really exciting, interesting movies all in one year. And like I said, and they kind of break down, there's kind of a big gamut, big variety of films in that year. So a lot of ones I'm super excited to talk about. I'm sure there's so many good ones this year, we probably won't even get to all of them. But I'll definitely let you kind of go off and sort of say your impression of this year, and then also you want to start talking about any films particularly that you're interested in?
I find 1980 kind of interesting because as I was looking up some of the statistics of that year, some of the bigger movies, when you look at the top 10 films of the year, at least domestically, you've got number one, of course, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, 9 to 5, Stir Crazy, Airplane, Any Which Way You Can, Private Benjamin, Coal Miner's Daughter, Smokey and the Bandit 2, The Blues Brothers, and Ordinary People.
Wow, Blues Brothers is in that list?
Yeah, it cracked the top 10. Number 11, I believe, was either The Shining or Popeye. Well, one of the other, it was something I was surprised to see got that close to the top 10 because the perception was always that it didn't do very well at the time. What's interesting to me is that I look at this list and obviously so many classic films, but you have a Star Wars movie. You have Any Which Way You Can was a sequel. Smoking the Bandit 2, obviously a sequel. The Blues Brothers is based on television. Popeye is based on a comic. This was also the year Superman 2 came out. It didn't crack the top 10 because it came out in December, so it's actually in the top 10 of 1981. It's properly a 1980 film. So frankly, we're looking at a lot of sequels, Star Wars movies, and comic book movies still in 1980, which is similarly carried over to now. But what a difference between the individuality of those. Flash Gordon was also 1980. All of these movies that were based on comic books and TV shows, and they all had such a unique thing to bring to cinema instead of all being caught up in this multiverse. And I'm not against the multiverse. I'm not a Marvel hater or a Disney hater. I pay money to go see these just like everybody else. But I do think that it's creating a creative void.
Well, I mean, this is a topic we could definitely wade deep into. I will say, as a nerd, as a guy who grew up, I worked at a comic store. I started collecting comics when I was 10 years old, when it was very uncool. The idea of an actual shared cinematic universe where you get to see multiple comic book characters, that was something I dreamed of since I was, like I said, since I was pretty much 10 years old. That I never thought I'd see. And I am a fan of those films. Do I think they're perfect movies? No, but there's this sort of homogenous, and they're good. The thing is, like, they are good for what they are. They're well-made films. They're well-crafted, well thought out, well-casted. But there's something about like you said, if you look at the diversity of not just the characters and the properties that were made in 1980, but just the approach to them, whether it is Flash Gordon, whether it is Superman 2, whether it is Popeye, those are all three very distinct films with their own distinct styles and
different studios as well.
Absolutely. But do I think do I think the Avengers films are better quality than most of those films? I mean, Superman 2 is an interesting movie, especially with like the whole history of it and it, being taken away from Donner. And I mean,
it's problematic, but
I still, as a kid, that was the movie. When I was a little baby boy, Superman 2 was the closest to a real comic book movie you ever saw. As great as Superman the movie is, and I do love it, who doesn't? Superman 2 felt more like an actual comic book. It had the big set pieces, the big action sequences. The thing is, like, I love them equally. I love, that's fine. Captain America Civil War, I think, is one of the best movies of the last 10 years. I think it's quintessentially what happens when you take a comic book movie with a clear vision and a clear approach that does sort of pay homage to you can tell how much they respect the source material, but they didn't let the source material completely dictate their cinematic vision. Perfect. That's it. It's hard to accomplish, but I think, I'm sorry, I was saying Civil War. Did I say Winter Soldier or Civil War?
You said Civil War.
I meant, Civil War is great, but I actually meant Winter Soldier. Winter Soldier is amazing. It's basically one of the best, like, action espionage movies. Just happens to be about Captain America and superheroes. But anyways.
Also just happens to co-star the director of Ordinary People, the Best Picture winner of this year.
That's right. Exactly.
Robert Redford.
That's right. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comparison. I will say, just as a year, there are more chances took in 1980 cinematically than we've had in the last 10 years. I mean,
agreed.
That's one of the things why I find it so exciting is because you're starting to see comic book movies like really trying to go after that market, trying to get like kids back into theaters, but you still have the Elephant Mans, you still have these really challenging, interesting movies by really challenging and interesting directors. So like I said, I'm super stoked to talk about this year. I know I have my favorites, but all in all, it's an amazing year. Was there any movie specifically you wanted to start talking about? Anything specifically that you feel you need to dive into?
Well, I feel like there's a bit of an elephant in the room. I think we should acknowledge, because people will just expect us to, Empire Strikes Back. Not so much to get it out of the way, but also just to get it out of the way.
That's funny because I was specifically not going to address it. I feel like my relationship with the Star Wars films is rocky at best, but I wasn't going to address it because I feel like what needs to be said about Empire Strikes Back. But it might be my first actual memory of being in the theater. I saw Empire Strikes Back in the theater as a little kid. I have specific memories when he's getting put into carbonite. There are specific memies as a kid where I just remember being on the edge of my seat.
Now, I'm a little bit behind you on that. My first memory of a Star Wars in the theater was Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
I was actually going to specifically ask you if you remember, because I don't. Do you remember the I Am Your Father scene? Because that is the scene that probably defines 1980.
Yeah, I would say that scene specifically, because I didn't even get the context, because I was probably, I think, maybe 4 years old at the time, depending on what, because I was born in January, so depending on where it is in the year. No, I still would have been. It doesn't matter, but like I don't even know if I had seen the first Star Wars when my parents took us to see it, but I remember that scene because it's such. Obviously, Luke's reaction to the news is so like. I don't like so catastrophic the way that Mark Hamill, really sort of sells that scene. So I remember as a kid being kind of like fucked up by it. Like, I don't know. And again, I didn't have the context for it. I don't know why it was upsetting for me, but the way that the scene itself rolls out, that obviously it's a big deal. He doesn't believe him. He's freaking out. And so, I mean, I will say though, and I'm not saying this as some sort of like nerd, because I could give a shit less about the character. One of the things I most remembered about it, even as a kid, was Boba Fett. Weirdly, I just still remember seeing him on screen and being kind of compelled about it. I don't know what kind of witchcraft fucking George Lucas. I'll tell you what, it's not even George Lucas. It was Christopher McQuarrie and all the design guys. Anyways, we could talk about Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back all day. But yeah, I mean, I will say, like, it is super important. Again, it is still like the height of Lucas's cinematic universe, like as far as films go. I mean, another sequence I still remember. In fact, I remember being like, when the doors open, they're on Bespin and the doors open, and then you see like all of a sudden you find out Lando sold them out and Vader's there. I remember being like really pissed off, being like, "What? Darth Vader's there!" And again, I don't even think I had too much context for it, but yeah, I mean, obviously it's an important, even for somebody like me who's had a very contentious relationship with Star Wars. Obviously, as a kid, I loved it. I had all the toys. It was super important. Obviously, changed history. So yeah, I mean, you have to bring it up.
Yeah,
and it was the number one money making film of the year. Obviously, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it was the number one, both domestically and internationally.
I believe it.
Empire was number one. And I think, again, not to go off on it too much, but I in terms of its influence, I really do think it is the sequel that started sequels, even though we'd already had an Exorcist 2 and a Rocky 2. And then going back further than that, I mean, you had all the Universal movies and Thin Man series. So sequels always existed. This was the first sequel that fully serialized and left us open-ended and made it possible for things like the Marvel multiverse to exist.
Yeah.
So I think more than any of the other Star Wars films, that one has actually probably had a bigger influence on film culture than any of the others.
I believe that. I wouldn't have a problem with that statement.
Now, the other one that's celebrating a 40th this year that's really big is The Shining, and I do want to give The Shining its due. I don't know whether what we just did counts as glossing over Empire Strikes Back exactly, but The Shining, I do think is worth talking about for half a moment here.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, if you're going to the most memorable movies of that era, I mean, obviously, it's one of the most memorable. It's probably in the top 3 most highly considered horror films of all time, for good reason. I mean, the performances are incredible. It's fucking Stanley Kubrick. I'm actually more interested in that film, and I do love the film. I think there's a lot of people out there who are like, fuck The Shining, like it's become popular to sort of bash it for whatever reason. Let me just say, like I said, I still love the film. It's the antithesis of what Stephen King, his point. There's some really amazing articles out there as far as why Stephen King isn't a fan. You think like, oh, obviously it's one of his best adaptations. It's one of his, if you're going purely by the mechanics of an adaptation, it's terrible. It completely misses the whole point of the novel. It takes away, Stanley Kubrick was an atheist, and this movie deals with like spirituality in the afterlife, and Stanley Kubrick didn't believe in all of that, which I don't have a problem with. But as far as like an adaptation, like the end of the book is about fire, Stanley Kubrick turned it into ice. There's a lot of weird like choices. So I think that's all fascinating. That being said, one of the most incredibly composed films of all time. The performances are genius. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about Kubrick himself and his poor Shelley Duvall and all sorts of things. But I mean, obviously, it's a fucking masterpiece. If you don't like The Shining, I don't know, do you not like movies? Like, I mean, it's fucking genius. That's all I'm gonna say.
I couldn't agree more. It actually seems to get more fascinating as I get older. There's endless amounts of material out there. There's a documentary about the following that the movie has. Yeah. There's the documentary that Stanley Kubrick's daughter made. That did show how Shelley Duvall was treated on the film, which is a style of directing that I don't agree with or condone one bit, but I understand at the time that was a thing.
Yep.
I think that's one of the main reasons why Kubrick has gotten such a reputation for being a dick. You talk to other people about Stanley Kubrick, and they will tell you stories about what a sweet guy he was or what a gentleman he was. Tom Cruise tells a story about Eyes Wide Shut, where he had the whole production shut down for a day because he thought a duck was sick in the pond in the background. And he wanted to get that duck to a vet.
I've heard that, yeah.
And he also, to keep with The Shining, he kept the fact that it was a horror movie away from Danny Lloyd, who is the little boy that played Danny in the movie, which is the polar opposite of the kind of directing he did with Shelley, where he wanted her to be on her edge. Now, certainly he wanted the little boy to be on the edge too. I don't know what kind of direction he was giving Danny Lloyd to keep from him what was going on. I do find it fascinating that he had that kind of sympathy or compassion for one member of the cast and not for the other. I mean, obviously, when choosing who to be a dick to, be less of a dick to the kid, but
yeah. Probably a good idea.
But and it's also been proven that Shelley Duvall had some pre-existing things going on. She had been very ill. She was going through a bad breakup, and she kind of has her own chemical imbalances. So it was just kind of a perfect storm of he shouldn't have been doing it in the first place, but he was doing it specifically to the wrong person to be doing it to. I don't know that another actress would have had the same reaction.
Plus, I mean, honestly, too, just Shelley Duvall's face looks like she's been traumatized. Like, she could just be standing there reading the paper and you're like, are you all right? You seem frazzled. She just has that face. But I mean, the thing is, like, it's definitely one of those films that has its own mythology. There's so much
that don't lead anywhere, and there's windows that shouldn't exist, and there's so much. It's really like peeling an onion. There's so many layers to The Shining and what's it about and whatever. And
yeah.
I think it was all specifically done to not have an answer. I think Kubrick is laughing somewhere about the fact that we're still trying to figure out what this movie's about, because I think what the movie's about is on its face. I think it's not trying to hide anything.
1,000%. Yeah, no.
His point was to get us to talk about, well, why does this curve that way and why does that lead over there? Well,
and again, and ultimately too, it's a sort of a man's descent into madness. Mm-hmm. Madness doesn't have a reason. It's madness, and like you have images that stir up to only give you a visceral reaction. That's it. There's no explanation to it. You can try to invent your own sort of logic to it, but you're fucking barking up the wrong tree.
I think people are not realizing, like they talk about Danny wearing the Apollo 11 shirt, and they said, well, that's from the guilt that Kubrick felt about faking the moon landing. No, that's Kubrick literally putting him in a sweater thinking this will drive him crazy.
Love it.
And we haven't said anything about Jack Nicholson yet, by the way, which
I mean,
almost goes without saying.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of the greatest performances in film history. There is legendary, and then there's Jack Torrance. Like, the character, the portrayal, everything about it, it's going to be popular for another 50 years. Like, it's perfect. It's one of those rare, perfect castings, performances. Like, I used to follow a Tumblr, and it was literally just every day, it was a different screenshot of Jack Nicholson. And every time it was one from The Shining, it was literally just like, well, that's perfect. Like, I already know what's happening. Like, even if I hadn't seen the movie, I know exactly what's happening there. And it's not even just like his madness looks. It's like him like trying to be. It's a fucking great performance. It's for a man who's had a career of amazing performances. To me, it will always be his defining moment, more than Cuckoo's, literally more than any of his films, because it is so powerful and so upsetting. The sequence when he's in the bar talking to the bartender / whatever, that, goddamn, I could watch that scene on loop forever. Like, there's so much under the surface tension, and like, he's on even at that, dude. It's such a fucking. I mean, what can you say? It's Jack Nicholson, The Shining. Of course, it's great. Everybody knows that. If you don't know that, what are you listening to this podcast for?
And I want to say, for the record, I am obsessed with the original ending. I have to see the original ending someday. There's no way Kubrick threw all of it out because he was too obsessive about collecting. And they're still finding stuff from 2001 that Warner Brothers won't release because it was against Kubrick's wishes.
Yeah.
So my feeling is that the ending of The Shining, for those of you that don't know, when The Shining came out theatrically, it only came out in the New York area and the Los Angeles area before it went wide. And during the time that it was playing LA and New York, it had a different ending. Not mind-blowingly different. It wasn't like Jack survived or anything. It was just there was an additional scene after Jack's death, and then it still wrapped up with the photograph of Jack Nicholson somehow magically in another time in the hotel. And Kubrick decided he didn't want that ending. And he went out and got, who I'm assuming had to been like two of the most discreet people working at any of the studios at the time. He sent people out to go to the theaters that were playing the movie up and down the California coast and up and down the through New York and New Jersey to literally cut the sequences out of the the reels that were being run. There were people, this has been confirmed, there were literally people who bought tickets and entered the theater to watch one version of The Shining and had it clipped upstairs while they were watching the movie and were that close to seeing the original ending and had no idea that they were missing it.
That's so crazy.
I just had to make a mention of that. It's one of my favorite parts of Shining folklore, and you can read up on it. There's a lot of stuff. There's pictures out now of it, but it's a fun little wormhole to go down. I do think, starting with The Shining here, this is probably a good time to talk about just what an amazing year of horror movies 1980 was.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing is, it was a great year for comedies, which I'm sure we'll get into, but as a huge horror fan, especially horror of that era, obviously the one that stands out the most, just because it has the biggest shelf life and the longest longevity, is obviously Friday the 13th, the original Friday the 13th, the Mrs. Voorhees Friday the 13th. Obviously, wasn't creating anything new, but I'm now blanking on the goddamn director's name. Sean Cunningham. He was an opportunist, but, obviously taking formula from a few films before it and then just really sort of having its own life. Rewatching it, is it a great movie? No. It's not a great movie. It's a fun movie, but it's not a great movie. But it's super important. I'm sitting a foot away from a huge collection of Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees merchandise, collectibles. Obviously, it had a huge effect on me. I think part 3 is really where the film franchise sort of really finds its footing, and it's sort of concretes its mythology. It's Friday the 13th is actually a very strange. There's a lot of continuity issues and all sorts of issues, timeline issues with the Friday the 13th, but it's such a fun film franchise. Jason Voorhees is a very memorable character. But obviously you start there if you're talking about horror, because it's in that upper pantheon, the upper echelon of horror film franchises. But of 1980, nowhere close to my favorite of films that came out. One of the most notorious films ever released in that year is Cannibal Holocaust. Yeah. And I feel like we could do a whole podcast just about Cannibal Holocaust. But before I go off on my own tangent, was there anything, do you have feelings on Friday the 13th?
I loved Friday the 13th. I grew up on it just like you did. I agree it's a very flawed film. It's sandwiched between other slasher franchises that really did try to do something different. Halloween was obviously the one that kind of started it all, although I think you could probably argue Texas Chainsaw Massacre had a lot to do with that as well. But Halloween was the first one that was really officially called a slasher movie.
Yes.
And it's kind of like similar to film noir, where people argue it was either M or Detour as to what started film noir. Texas Chainsaw is kind of like M, and Halloween's kind of like Detour, the official start, and then Nightmare on Elm Street was still a thing to come. And that, by introducing the supernatural element to the slasher film, created its own beast. So Friday the 13th really does kind of rest in between these two as just kind of a fun movie. It wasn't trying to reach to be anything spectacular.
Exactly.
I actually met, what's her name, who played Mrs. Voorhees?
Betsy Palmer.
Betsy Palmer. I met Betsy Palmer when I worked at an art house theater in New York City. She randomly came in, or at least
I love the story.
Random, yes. And it took me a second. She still looked like herself. She was still a very beautiful woman, actually a lot prettier than she was in Friday the 13th. And I approached her somewhat cautiously, and I asked if she was really her, and she was so excited to run into a fan. And she talked to me for about 15 minutes while she waited for a movie to start. And I was sitting there with another friend of mine, another usher at the time. His name was Jason, and he had no idea who she was. And I introduced the two of them, and when I said his name was Jason, she goes, "Oh, my boy," and she gives him this big hug. And I just remember him looking over her shoulder like, what's going on? Who the hell is this?
I love it.
But yeah, I love that she embraced it, because she really did have more of a, let's say, a Mary Poppins sort of reputation prior to Friday the 13th. And the fact that she embraced that her biggest fandom at that point in her life was Friday the 13th, I applaud that.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing is like, as a fan of genre films, it always bums me out when you find out actors sort of disavow and disown, their previous, participation in quote unquote lowbrow films or genre films. So I'm always happy to hear that celebrities or actors sort of embrace those roles as well, especially because if you think about like the bread and butter for a lot of those people, it is those films that really kind of made them their money. But I mean, obviously I'm sure she gets it a lot too. Like, I'm sure like if she gets recognized, it's for being Pamela Voorhees, and the fact that, again, that she still sort of plays it up is really sweet, because that God knows she could have been very cold about it. Obviously, like I said, it's probably the most well-known of the films. I mean, outside of obviously The Shining. Talking about Cannibal Holocaust, that's a very interesting movie. Its legacy is very interesting.
I will never watch it again. Never.
It's funny because it doesn't, even the real shit that they filmed doesn't kind of bother me. I think it's more interesting just the lengths that the filmmakers would go to make $1, and it is actually still kind of an interesting movie.
I agree. It's not even real. I don't like the animal sacrifice stuff.
Yeah,
the stuff that happens to the humans is fascinating and enjoyable to me.
Yeah, no, and I understand, and that's the thing. As an animal lover, I get it too. Culturally, though, like the cultural stuff that does actually happen in the world, like, I mean, that's a lot to unpack. But I will say this: at the end of the day, there are a lot of movies that it spawned a lot of copycats. But it's, like I said, it's still a quality. Did you ever see The Green Inferno?
No, I've been meaning to. And again, I'm not against Cannibal Holocaust being a cult classic. I knew going into it, I got to see it for the first time at a midnight screening, so I got to see it in the theater, and I knew what I was walking into. I knew that some people have been very offended by what happens in the end of the movie, which is all phony.
Yeah.
I also knew what happened to the animals through the shooting of the movie, which is not phony. And so anyone who is watching this movie really needs to be aware that you were walking into a movie that has some brutal animal deaths that did not need to happen. And I made myself watch it because I felt like I had to see it objectively.
Yeah.
And now that I have, I can tell you that I found that the conceit of it was very interesting. The found footage element has obviously stood the test of time. It's the first thing I can point to that has that found footage.
It's the grandfather of the found footage. Yeah, definitely.
And that was done very well. So for this one reason, I will say I'll never see it again, but I'm not saying that necessarily standing in judgment of it. I don't think that director even would do it again the same way.
No.
Although he did go to court for some other, he had to bring the actors to a courtroom to prove that he didn't kill them, which I find fascinating.
Was that the film that Charlie Sheen turned in as a snuff movie? I can't remember. No. Was it? No, God, that's going to bother me. But young Charlie Sheen turned a movie in because he thought it was a snuff movie and it was just a horror movie. And then they actually had to go to court. I think that might be it. Yeah, and they had to go to court. And then I think there was some other lawsuits with that film as well, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, the stuff with like, I guess my thing is like, as an animal lover, I don't want to see animals hurt ever. Obviously, there is a lot of stuff that happens with indigenous people or other, not even indigenous, just other cultures and things like that have a different relationship with. I don't know. It's, like I said, it's a lot to unpack there. I don't want to get too deep into that. That's not what this podcast is about. But I just don't want to. I like to tread carefully in that. But I like I said, as an animal lover, it bothers me as well. Everything like in the traces of death, and even faces of death, even though that shit's mostly hokey nonsense. It was never the stuff that with the humans that bothered me. But again, anything with animals. That's a terrible thing to say. But obviously, like I said,
I follow though.
Yeah, like it's hard to watch innocent animals get hurt. Watching animals suffer is never a good time. But obviously, it's a very important film in what it did, and like you said, definitely as an early. I don't know if it is the earliest, but it's one of the earliest examples of the found footage genre, subgenre, whatever. But it was known for being so gory. But I would actually give the most innovative gore or the most innovative violence of a film that year goes to Maniac.
I love Maniac.
Yeah, Maniac is one of those movies that I would consider a perfect film. I know that sounds weird, but if you consider the budget, what it's trying to be, it nails everything it does. First off, it's as a fan of art and design, it still has, I think, one of the best like film posters, advertising artwork ever. You know, I actually used to have poster of it sitting on my wall. But it's a movie. I'm already a big gigantic nerd for William Lustig anyways. I think some of my favorite, whether it's Vigilante, Maniac Cop, I just love William Lustig. I actually got to meet him. I got to go see the band Goblin perform, and he was 2 rows in front of me, and I was like, holy shit, that's so William cool. Lustig. Yeah, and so I got a photo with him. I was like, even in the photo, I look like a crazy person because my eyes are the size of saucers. I'm like, it's William Lustig. Anyways, and I got to talk to him about Vigilante, which I think is a criminally underrated movie.
Yes, I agree with you there. One of Robert Forster's best.
Yes, and I mean, let's have a whole episode. We should actually have a whole episode about Robert Forster. Let's put that on the agenda. But it's a great fucking movie. You know, in the history of memorable faces in cinema, poor Joe Spinell. Such a fucking great actor. You know, I feel like didn't have like a giant career as far as like not like a well-known actor, but he's in so many great movies.
He's one of the ultimate that guys. I mean, he's in the top 5 that guys.
I agree 100%. It's funny because this movie at the time, even today, it like holds up. The fact that like it's such a it feels like a slimy movie.
You want to take a shower when it's done, and that's coming from a huge fan of it.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. But the thing is, it's funny, is that it's one of the most realistic and human portrayals of a maniac ever. He's a real person. He's not fucking a ghoul. He's not a fucking, he's not a slasher monster, slasher villain, slasher killer. He's a human being, and it's the way that his portrayal is so memorable and also very grounded. And like I said, that fucking dude could be playing a literal Catholic saint, but just because of his face, he feels like, ugh, like, this guy is creepy. And he really like leans into that, and it's a great looking movie. And again, I have such a weakness for films that take place in that like late 70s, early 80s, like New York, the sort of sleazy what's the street with all this like the old like
42nd Street,
42nd Street. I don't know why I blanked on that. I use that term 42nd Street all the time, but that 42nd Street sort of vibe of New York. Anyways, yeah, it's one of my favorite movies, hands down. It's a fucking great movie. Even the remake is fucking really solid.
I still haven't seen that. I will eventually, but I've seen the original at least 10 times. I've owned it on every format it comes out.
The format, yeah.
And it's partly because Bill Lustig still owns the rights, and Bill Lustig, just to give a shout out, owns Blue Underground, one of the greatest companies putting out re-releases of Blu-rays and now 4Ks. He's got Maniac out on 4K, which I still need to pick up.
Which I didn't even know that. I need to look into that.
Just came out within weeks ago. He put out on the same day, he put out Maniac and Fulci's Zombie. So those are now on 4K UHD.
I've been buying physical media as much because we're trying to buy a house and all these things. So, but I haven't bought like an actual Blu-ray, or I have a 4K TV, haven't actually bought a 4K Blu-ray player yet. But I used to be somebody who, Devin, you know this. I know you're the same. Like a new release was coming out, I was getting it. Like especially for like genre films, especially low budget horror stuff that doesn't, you don't see get released a lot. So, but yeah, I mean, Blue Underground's amazing. They do all the most choice exploitation movies, horror movies, whatever. I mean, they're definitely they cultivate to my taste. But yeah, Maniac is fucking incredible. I feel like if you are getting into the horror genre and you want to see, and again, we didn't even talk about the fact one of the greatest on-screen kills of all time. I still think
I know you're talking about.
The shotgun blast in the car.
Savini.
I think Savini still says it's one of his best he's ever done, and it's still holds up. It's still insane. I went on 4K just for that scene.
It's frightening. It's exhilarating. But it's also still got that healthy dose of early 80s cheese in a weird way.
Absolutely.
It's not a real head exploding. It kind of has all the elements that need to be there for a couple of guys like you and me.
Right on. I couldn't have said it better.
And you should go out and buy it on 4K because one of the main reasons to continue to buy home media, even though I've slowed down too, and that has a lot to do with just not having enough in the wallet. I like streaming stuff, but eventually they're gonna take our physical media away.
Yeah.
Movies like Maniac specifically, like, okay, Avengers Endgame, that will be available streaming forever for the rest of the existence of mankind and electricity. Yep. You will have access to all the Avengers movies.
That's right.
You may not always have access to things like Maniac. You may not always have access to things like Zombie. I'll even say Cannibal Holocaust.
Absolutely.
Even though it's not one for my collection, it might be one for yours. And honestly, it's not the type of thing that Netflix is necessarily going to want to associate themselves with. So when you are making the decisions on what to buy, think of those things. Buy the stuff that you think may not be popular enough or may be too outrageous to pop up on, on any of the streaming services.
I've said this many times, but I would tell people, like, for the longest time, especially for certain movies, I'd be like, oh, I still buy VHS. And like, oh, you're such a hipster. I'm like, no, it has nothing to do with that. I'm like, a lot of movies I love, they were never released. There is no cinematic print of it. It was never released in cinema. There's no film print. It was shot on video. So owning a VHS is like owning an original print. It's how it was originally released. So I like having that because I feel like this is the closest thing I have to capturing how the film was originally released and in that. So as much as I love the Blu-rays too and the 4K transfers and all of fancy modern conveniences that we have, there's something about also even just owning a VHS of some of these movies because again, that's how it was released. This is the first and only way you would have watched this is owning it or seeing it on VHS. So that's still an important thing for me is when I'm able to, especially for those movies that I love, it's owning a copy of it on VHS if possible. But that the VHS collector's market has become so oversaturated and so over. I used to be able to buy a VHS on eBay from a direct seller for like $5 to $8. That same movie now would be $100 to $150, and it's like it's fucking ridiculous. But yeah, that's like anything. People ruin everything. One of the other, obviously, it's, like I said, we could talk about every single movie that came out this year, the year that in 1980. But two films that I just want to quickly touch upon is huge fan of. Because there's like Changeling is a fucking great movie. There's a ton of really solid. Virus came out this year, but two movies I just want to quickly touch upon because I am a fan of Italian horror and is. City of the Living Dead, aka The Gates of Hell, for Lucio Fulci, and then Opera by Dario Argento, which I think Opera is one of his most underrated. I mean, horror fans do love it, but I still feel like Opera of his filmography, I think, is criminally underrated. I think it's one of my favorites of his Argento's. And again, one of like stylistically and cinematically, I think it's a really beautiful looking movie. So I feel like those had to be said.
Yeah, absolutely. Our Fulci is really interesting. I've always loved Fulci, and Argento is actually has some similarities to our last week's topic, Brian De Palma.
Absolutely. Yep. So it's funny because we had talked about, after we had finished filming, we had talked about how we both had sort of forgotten, you'd brought it up, but I completely agreed with you that De Palma is sort of the only real classic American giallo director and how much Dressed to Kill sort of fits into that distinct, Italian genre. But yeah, I will say too, we obviously Dressed to Kill 1980, we already talked about it, but obviously it should be mentioned. It's a great very interesting film, obviously.
And if you're a Michael Caine fan, you have to see it.
Absolutely, 100%.
And just an interesting side note, Sean Connery almost played the part that Michael Caine played, I found out.
I did not know that, really.
I can't see Sean Connery playing the transgender murderer.
I don't think... I would be surprised if he would take it. It seems so like he would be interesting. I mean, that's it. I definitely... I'll just say glad, though, Michael Caine. It was Michael Caine. I'll just leave it there.
Absolutely.
Obviously, Prom Night's a very interesting film. I think actually like a very interesting movie. We talk about it. But I feel like I can't do a podcast where there is a John Carpenter movie could be mentioned and I don't talk about it. I feel like that's a crime. I feel like...
I was hoping you would mention it.
Yeah. This era of Carpenter is... I mean, everything he was doing was fucking great. Everything was getting knocked to the park. I think The Fog is a great example of just one of like such a great cast. I mean, man, I still had such a... I think Adrienne Barbeau might be the first actress I legitimately had huts for. But Adrienne Barbeau, I mean, it's a great cast. It's a great ghost story. The fucking effects are great. The atmosphere is great. The remake is one of... I'm not, hey, Mr. All remakes suck. I don't shit on things like just, I let a movie stand on its own credentials. I let a movie stand on its own 2 feet. If it's good, it's good. If it sucks, it sucks. But man, that sequel is garbage. But the original, and I feel like there's an argument, like a lot of like really juvenile arguments of like, oh, this remake ruined my childhood, or it's like, dude, the original still exists. And I usually argue at that point.
It takes Bill Cosby ruins your childhood, okay?
That's right.
The Fog doesn't ruin your childhood. Female Ghostbusters don't ruin your childhood.
Don't ruin your childhood, yeah. Your childhood still exists. but you're also a grown ass person and move the fuck on. But with that being said, I do feel like The Fog never was like one of Carpenter's most beloved. It definitely has its audience, but it's never in that top 5 that people drag about, even though I feel like it definitely deserves that admiration, just like, his other films. But I do feel like that The Fog remake is sort of, when I start mentioning The Fog and people see that look in people's face, I had to be like, wait, I'm talking about apparently 80, the 1980 version, the original Carpenter version. But
I think a lot of people didn't realize how much they loved the original Fog until the remake was so bad.
You might be correct about that.
It's about the time that people started talking about it. I mean, you and I have always talked about Carpenter, all things Carpenter, but I do think The Fog was generally overlooked until that dreadful remake came out, and everyone suddenly.
And
realizes...
I wanted to like the remake. I was never the biggest Smallville fan, but I was rooting for old Tom Welling. I was like, yeah, sure, let this guy do his thing. Like, but no, that movie's trash. It's so, especially if you go back and rewatch the original, like the atmosphere that, dude, I don't know, it is what it is, but definitely one of my favorite like sort of ghost story movies. But like anything Carpenter, I mean, even Carpenter's worst films are worth checking out. I would even go so far as to say I don't think Carpenter had actually made an actual bad movie. He's just made varying degrees of good movies.
I agree with that. I think that's fair.
Some more successful than others, but I have some pretty controversial statements. Ghost of Mars being one that's pretty contentious to most people. They hate the movie. I think it's fucking amazing, but to each their own. I see the flaws in the movie, but it's one of his movies that literally actually kind of I don't get scared by movies, don't get freaked out, but there's something about that movie that actually fucking gets under my skin and upsets me a little bit. It's actually kind of scary to me. But anyways, with that being said, great year for horror. Obviously, there's really some quintessential films. Obviously, The Shining, Friday the 13th, Campbell Holocaust, a lot of like really important movies. But it's also a great movie.
Was that year?
Oh, was it? Oh, interesting.
It was on Siskel and Ebert's list of the worst movies of 1980. As a matter of fact,
one day, I actually have very interesting. So,
Motel Hell was that year too.
Motel Hell, one of the fucking greatest. There's all kind of critters in Farmer Vincent's Fritters. It's a movie I've talked about that on other podcasts that I also do. That movie is quintessential 80s. I mean, there's Humanoids from the Deep. There's so many good horror movies from this year. Was there anything you wanted to say about any of those films or any other horror movies you wanted to bring up?
Just that I love them. I mean, this was really an incredible year. I have Inferno is coming out in 82, speaking of Argento. So Argento had 2 that year, apparently. Mother's Day was that year. A good year to be Jamie Lee Curtis between The Fog and Prom Night and Terror Train.
Right. Oh, shit, with Terror. See, I'm looking, I guess that maybe my list of 1980s releases isn't as comprehensive as yours, but...
No, you're listing stuff that I didn't have, too. I will never forgive myself for having forgotten that Maniac was 1980.
Yeah, dude, 1980, bro. What a year. But as much as, like I said, obviously a great year for horror movies, but also a pretty fucking great year for comedies. Especially, I think if you're, obviously you have Stir Crazy. We are both fans of 9 to 5, it turns out. I grew up with that movie. My mom was a giant Dolly Parton fan. Anything Dolly Parton we would watch in our house, and I who doesn't love fucking Dolly Parton? But I mean, great cast.
It's un-American to dislike Dolly Parton. I'll stand by that.
Exactly. I found some pretty interesting things about Dolly Parton recently. That things that she's contributed to financially, things that she's been donating to for years, nobody knew about. So and interesting there, but we'll save that for a later conversation.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, great year for God. This is just looking at the list. There's so much we could talk about. Heaven's Gate for 2 hours.
Yeah, Heaven's Gate really. If you haven't jumped on the train yet to re-examine Heaven's Gate, and for anyone that doesn't know, Heaven's Gate was probably the most discussed movie of 1980 in 1980.
Yep. Yeah,
it was
the original Waterworld. Yep.
It was a huge flop. It was tampered with by the studio to such an extent they cut, I believe it was over an hour off of the movie.
Yep. It was over an hour, yep.
And then they couldn't figure out why nobody wanted to see it. And a couple years later on the Z Channel, which I don't know if anybody outside of Los Angeles really knows what the Z Channel is. The Z Channel was like HBO before there was HBO, and in fact, HBO was their direct competitor and ultimately won. But the Z Channel was run by a guy, I can't remember his name right now, but there's a fascinating documentary out there called The Z Channel Magnificent Obsession.
It's a fucking phenomenal documentary. If you're a film fan,
it will give you a checklist of everything you need to see from that era. That movie is like a cinema checklist. And the
that
man
movie
himself,
is responsible for, the Z Channel is literally responsible for one of my top 3 films of all time, Three Women, Robert Altman's Three Women. It wasn't for that movie, I might not have ever seen it, or at least not seen it at the age I saw it. Fucking great documentary. It's like you said, perfect. It's like, it is literally, it brings up every movie you need to see from the 70s, early 80s. It's a great documentary.
Exactly. And the guy who programmed the Z Channel, who ultimately, it's the reason they made a documentary about him, is he was involved in a murder-suicide. He was the suicide. He was also the murderer. Very sad story. Fascinating, but sad story. But at the time, he was the one who really championed the director's cut of Heaven's Gate. He got it shown on the Z Channel as an uncut film, and I'll be damned, the critics saw it and switched around to naming it one of the best movies of the decade. So don't always believe what you hear about these things. Heaven's Gate is a really interesting film. It's probably not the most exciting thing you're going to see, and it doesn't need to be. But it's a slow burn. It takes its time. It knows how to pace itself. If you're watching the actual original cut, which is available as a Criterion Collection release.
I was going to say, it's currently on the Criterion Channel as well, if you want to watch it.
But yeah, I guess we probably would have been irresponsible without mentioning Heaven's Gate in 1980.
And I think it's one of the first examples, or one of the very early examples, of how discussion of finances and how much it's costing, it's going over budget, and all the, like, sort of how much poison can be taken from the film tabloids, and the Hollywood gossip, and the fact that, like, people already hated it before the movie came out. They thought,
they didn't like what it cost.
Exactly. And the thing is, somebody who's seen the movie, I think it's one of the most beautiful films, one of the most beautiful looking films. Like I said, it is a slow burn. It's very poetic feeling, long shots, but what a great film. Great cast. I mean, I know you're a fan of the cast.
Chris Christopherson, I could watch all day.
I know, exactly. So
Jeff
I really
Bridges
cannot
too.
hear Chris I really cannot hear the words Chris Christopherson without thinking of you. So yeah, definitely needs to be talked. But let's talk about some of the fun movies.
Yes.
Let's talk about Caddyshack and how important Caddyshack was. Weirdly, I didn't know it until recently. It wasn't the huge success that I thought it was. I mean, it was successful, whatever. But to me, it was like an Animal House level of success, and apparently that's not true. Where did it end up on the highest grossing?
Certainly not in the top 10. I don't have it anywhere on here.
Okay, yeah. So like I said, I thought it was a big moneymaker, but apparently it wasn't. It sort of found more of a life a little bit later. But what a fucking great movie. Rodney being Rodney, which was interesting. I didn't know Rodney came to that movie and he basically wrote all of his lines. Like, he just basically did his act. And a lot of the people didn't know where the fuck it was going. Like, they're like, wait, what? So, but you have Rodney.
He was apparently a little confused on the making of it too. It's the directorial debut of Harold Ramis, which is worthy of mention.
Yep, absolutely.
But Ramis was having a hard time with Rodney. Rodney kept on losing confidence, which you need to have your confidence for a role like that. And he figured out what it was that Rodney was saying his lines and then holding for the laugh, because it was Rodney's first big film. And the cast and crew were not laughing at what Rodney Dangerfield was saying, even though it was hysterical. And so he thought he was doing horrible. And he had to have it explained. They're not supposed to laugh, Rodney. You're not performing a live gig here. We'll all laugh about it later, but don't hold for the laughs.
And that's the thing is, because he had I watched a documentary about him not that long ago, just maybe 2 months ago, about Rodney. I went down this weird rabbit hole of his like Tonight Show performances and his whole history, and then I was like, well, let me watch this documentary, and it was actually pretty fascinating. But he'd been a stand-up performer for a long time, but because stardom, real success didn't come until he was into his middle ages. He did, he struggled with confidence, his whole career. But he thought he thought he was stinking it up a little. Obviously history has been much more kind to his performance than he was. But
yeah,
fucking just head to toe a great cast. Chevy Chase at his best.
Yes.
Bill Murray being fucking Bill Murray. I think the criminally underrated Ted Knight, who fucking crushes it in everything he does.
And so sad this was his last film too.
Yep, which is very heartbreaking. And the thing is too,
he still got his TV show Too Close to Comfort after that.
Exactly.
But this was his last film.
Cow. Yes, it was his last movie. But yeah, it's a great movie. Obviously, it's for there's that era, that late 70s to early 80s, that raunchy but genuinely truly funny
frat humor for sure.
Kind of the height of art frat humor. Exactly. But what a fucking fun movie. I still remember seeing Caddyshack 2 in the theater, but in Laughlin, Nevada.
I'm so sorry.
I could have gone to see Deadpool. Not the Marvel character Deadpool. I'm talking about Dirty Harry Deadpool.
Which was actually a good movie.
Yeah, it's very memorable watching Jim Carrey basically. Anyways, what an interesting movie that is. But anyways,
when we go over 1988, we'll do that one.
We'll do that. But anyways, and I was really sorely disappointed in Caddyshack 2. But Caddyshack still holds up, still a great movie. I mean, there's a ton I want to talk about, but Devin, is there any of these comedies?
I think it's worth kind of tying these two together because Caddyshack is one of the most quoted comedies of all time.
Mm-hmm.
People are still quoting Caddyshack, especially the Bill Murray character, and it's a real Cinderella story. And the other one that I would say is probably just as quotable still to this day, Airplane came out in 1980.
I literally quoted it 2 days ago.
my 12-year-old daughter quotes Airplane.
It's one of the Zucker brothers are interesting because the Naked Gun movie, like that whole era of, or I don't even know what you would call it, like I don't know, farces, like I don't even know what you would call them, but they
Naked almost Guns deserve their own genre. It's Zucker comedy. Yeah. Zucker
exactly.
and Abrams.
That's right.
Airplane, Top Secret, Naked Gun, Hot Shots, all of those films. It was really only at the top of their game for about 10 years. But God, it seemed like everything they touched was gold for a while. I don't think Hot Shots was actually that. I think Abrams did Hot Shots without the Zuckers. But same. I mean,
it's basically the exact same thing. It's those are kind of films are not normally my favorite kind of movies, but Airplane is one of those movies that, like, I mean, it's dated in lots of sort of ways.
Yes.
But goddamn, it's so genuinely funny. And
when you try for that many laughs, you're gonna land enough times.
Exactly.
If you're going for a laugh a minute and it's 90 minutes long, you're gonna tickle everybody at some point, just not everybody at the same time.
Exactly. I would say that, in the Zuckers, Abrams, I think it's literally like it's their Citizen Kane. It's like as great as a lot of the other ones were. I still think it's the one that holds up the best. I mean, there's so many great jokes in it. Again, not always the most PC or sensitive jokes, but some great jokes.
Kind of important for coming out in the 80s too, because it kind of almost single-handedly crushed the trend of the disaster movie coming out of the 70s.
That's right. That's true.
There was no reason to do disaster movies after Airplane, and in fact,
well, that's like anything. Once you start to see the satires come out, then you know that genre is on its last leg. There's going to be movies we don't like. We don't need to talk about The Blue Lagoon.
No.
I mean, we don't need to talk about Xanadu or Urban Cowboy. But one movie I
watched Urban Cowboy again this week, as a matter of fact.
Did you?
There are some interesting things to say about Urban Cowboy, but
well, you can definitely, Devin, you can talk about every you want to talk about. But I do want to say one movie that has to be brought up is The Blues Brothers.
Yes.
As growing up, I felt like there's a certain segment of the nerds, like as at the age I am, I remember when nerds were genuinely there. It wasn't cute. There was no TV shows about being a nerd. But there was this weird subculture, and not only did nerd culture love Dungeons and Dragons and Star Trek and all these things, there was also there was a big segment of nerds that loved Monty Python. There was like Monty Python nerds.
Oh yeah.
But one of the films, for whatever reason, that I know, it felt like you had to be a genuine a real nerd, you had to love Blues Brothers. And I knew all of the nerds I loved, like all the older nerds, all the guys I looked up to. Like, oh, you've never seen Blues Brothers? John Landis. There's a lot we could talk about John Landis. We'll save that for another podcast. But at height of his best, Blues Brothers was the first truly successful Saturday Night Live movie. It's still the best Saturday Night Live. I mean, Wayne's World is fine. I don't dislike Wayne's World.
Doesn't
I like
come
Wayne's World.
Close to Blues Brothers though, in terms of being a great.
I mean,
movie.
look at the fucking just the cast of musicians they got in this shit. Cab Calloway, Aretha Franklin, like
Ray Charles.
Exactly. Dude, like it doesn't
James Brown.
Like I said, it's like literally, and the set pieces are amazing. The stunt work is insane. And then you boil it down, but at the essence, you have two amazing performances by Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi. The height of what they're doing,
the greatest car chase of all time.
Dude, amazing.
And oddly enough, okay, it has the greatest car chase of all time, and I'm still not talking about the car chase in it that takes place in a shopping mall.
A big mall, exactly. Dude, and that
car chases all throughout, and every one of them is unique and perfect.
And I'll say this too. Every time I watch it, it never fails that I'm watching it, and we'll be taking out a movie for a minute, going like, "God damn, how did they do this?" Or "Damn, this is still insane." It's not just my memory. This movie, the car chases are so crazy. But yeah, what a fucking great movie. Probably like of all of the quote unquote comedies of that year, like some great legendary comedies, still probably my favorite.
My parents, by the way, they saw the Blues Brothers as a live act open for Steve Martin. That had to have been one of the greatest shows to ever attend.
And the thing is, it's funny because I was reading, Steve Martin has a really great autobiography that I feel like really eye-opening. You sort of really, because he's such a personal guy. I have an interesting story about Steve Martin. I'm a huge Steve Martin fan. He's very notorious for being unapproachable, which is fine. Like, he's a very private person. I have no problem with that. I don't think celebrities owe me anything. Like, there's this whole fucking weird, people are toxic to begin with, but there's this thing that some fans have was like, well, you have to respect your fans because we made you rich. No, that's not how that works. They made a product, whether it was a film or TV show, and you enjoy it. You paid your money to see it, or you use your time to see if it's on TV.
Throwing down money to watch The Jerk is not paying your taxes.
Yeah. Well, and ultimately, look, man, like people people can't fathom anything outside their own existence. You can't imagine what it would be like to be somebody like Steve fucking Martin, who's literally a walking legend. He's Steve Martin. The dude is a legend. So I'm sure that guy would get hassled, or does get hassled constantly. But funny story is a friend, my wife worked at the SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And Steve Martin is notorious for being a art lover, a big, huge fan of the arts and a supporter of the arts. So he would go in there consistently. But a friend of ours named Andrew, who worked at the museum store, saw him, and he's a huge Steve Martin fan. I mean, legitimately a huge Steve Martin fan, and saw him from across the store and became shell-shocked, but ended up locking eyes with Steve Martin, and Steve Martin looked at him, and again, this is a podcast, so it's not going to be as, but Steve Martin basically just looked at him deadpan, just shook his head, like, don't even think about it. And Andrew got so deflated, but my thing is like, dude, mad respect. Just be upfront with it. Just be like, no, please,
that's
please
great.
don't.
And then you can be on the polar opposite side of that. To bring up Caddyshack again, you got Bill Murray, who to his fans, story about a guy who was sitting at a Wendy's eating his burger and fries, and Bill Murray comes out of nowhere, sits next to him, grabs a couple of his fries, dips it in his ketchup, eats the fries in his face, and then stands up and says, "And nobody will believe you," and walks away.
Yeah, there's so many. The Bill Murray, we could have a whole. I have a pretty interesting story about Bill Murray.
The artist is the point. I just wanted to.
Exactly. Yeah.
If the artist wants to approach you, that's fine.
Exactly. But yeah, so there's some of the best comedies. There's other movies I could talk about forever. The Exterminator being one of them. I am a huge fan of the late 70s, 80s, quote unquote, vigilante subgenre of the exploitation films.
And that's a Grindhouse classic.
Grindhouse classic, yeah. And, Exterminator 2 is actually, I think, the better of the films, is at least the more exciting. The original Exterminators kind of takes itself very seriously. But it's a great fucking movie, and it has a great cast. Robert Ginty as the lead, I think he's fucking great. Steve James, who's also in the American Ninja franchise, is really great. But it definitely has this real gritty, I just felt like Savage Streets, all the Death Wish films, like as we've already talked about in this film or on this podcast, Lustig's Vigilante. But anyways, it's a great movie. We could talk about that. There's a lot of great dramas of this. I mean, some really cool, great, memorable dramas from 1980. We've talked about Heaven's Gate being one of them.
Raging Bull.
Raging Bull. I mean, let's talk about Raging Bull. I mean, if you're going to talk about fucking Empire Strikes Back, we have to talk about Raging Bull.
It's the movie that brought De Niro and Pesci together for the first time on screen, which is pretty incredible. I mean, we're talking about we're less than, or I guess we're about 6 months away from the year that brought us The Irishman, which will be the last time we see De Niro and Pesci together on the screen. If you're going to watch one or the other, I definitely say go with Raging Bull.
Oh God, yes. It's got the greatest question in film history, which is, you fuck my wife? I could literally, oh God. I mean, I'm laughing, because it's such a ridiculous, I mean, that's one of the most brutal, heartbreaking sequences in film. I mean, that whole thing is just so violent and real and upsetting and
it was a time
tragic.
Where it was a biofilm in a year that had a couple of really good biofilms. Coal Miner's Daughter, you mentioned.
That's going to definitely be him.
And The Elephant Man is another great biofilm.
Yep.
All of these films, something they have in common is that none of them are really feel-good movies. They're all
no,
they're all
not at all.
Downers. Raging Bull is not about an American hero. It's actually about an American piece of shit.
Yep.
And I think it's worthy of point. I don't think Raging Bull works now. I don't, in terms of if someone tried to make it now. I think it still works now as a classic. But nobody would be bold enough to make that movie now. And it's really kind of a statement on how sad society has become, because people would think that it's glorifying who he was. His career certainly had some highs, but his personal life seemed to be all lows. And it's really interesting that Scorsese took this material. It was recommended to him by De Niro. De Niro really wanted to play this part, and I really got to hand it to him. This is something you would never see done nowadays, that just couldn't be done, and they did it so masterfully, and they did it without blinking. They did it full on and really let you know that this person is not a good person, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been a lot said about, like, it's one of the very first performances when an actor really went through extraordinary measures to sort of change their body, and the effort that De Niro put into that, which is still very impressive. I mean,
it's
and
legendary.
The physicality, legendary. And the physicality of that character is so important. And even the sequence when he's in prison and he's punching the wall and headbutting the wall, it's a great, very memorable sequence. It's, obviously Scorsese knows a little bit about making a good movie, but there's a physicality. He's almost like an animal at that point. And there's a violence in him. And it's like De Niro really embodies that. Like, was De Niro the most believable boxer? No, because fucking Scorsese didn't give a shit about it being a quote unquote believable. Like, that wasn't what he was concerned with. He was making a movie and he knew that. But
he choreographed the boxing like a dance.
Yeah, exactly. What a great movie. Definitely deserved the Oscar nomination or Oscar win over Ordinary People, which is not a bad movie. Ordinary People's
Ordinary People's a good movie. Judd Hirsch and Mary Tyler Moore are no slouches. Great actors, great director in Robert Redford. I have no problem with Ordinary People. It's here we have limited time to talk about the rest of 1980, and the Best Picture winner is the one that I just kind of want to clear past it because I don't have much to say about it.
Yeah, exactly. And
it's a great movie. The thing is, if you like great movies, but
yeah. I mean, it's fine, but it's definitely it's a safe movie.
I think Elephant Man is the one that gummed up the works that year for the Oscars. I think everybody was voting for Raging Bull and Elephant Man, and Ordinary People took the win because it took the basically the third place high of having the first and second place being torn between two other films that
Gotcha.
were way better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's talk about Elephant Man. What a fucking, I mean, look, we could have a whole
two black and white movies too. I just put that together.
Yeah. Well, the thing is too, and even though they're miles apart as far as the subject matter, they're actually like I said, they're both tragic. They're both sometimes very hard to watch.
They're about the worst of humanity.
Yeah.
You walk away from Elephant Man ashamed of being a human being.
Absolutely. Agree with you 1,000%. And,
the story is so good, so powerful.
Yeah. And again, fucking David Lynch. I mean, rarely, like, people think that David Lynch is incapable of making a more, how do I put this? Like, I guess a more straightforward script, a more straightforward film, a more like linear movie, I guess an easier to understand movie. But obviously there's the straight story. There's Elephant Man. Like, David Lynch is a very capable filmmaker. He going beyond his own like inner psyche and like the films that the more more like like what we would consider the Lynchian approach to filmmaking. The dude's just a fucking great filmmaker. Really understands how important visuals are in cinema.
Oh, light and shadow.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, I understand. Especially in this, yeah. But it's one of those movies. It's very heartbreaking. The thing I feel like everybody talks. Yeah, it's John Hurt. The performance is amazing. Like I said, it's very hard to watch. Goddamn, the special effects in this are so goddamn good.
Yes.
You forget that it's not the.
You think you're looking at the real John Merrick. You forget that it's John Hurt.
Exactly. That was exactly my point.
I'm completely convinced.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that's so important in filmmaking, that suspension of disbelief. And, you don't want to be looking at like, oh, that's how interesting that actor is in that makeup. You want to just see a fully, like a character, and goddamn, this movie. And I think, honestly, the choice to film it in black and white was fucking genius. I've never seen too many like documentaries about it or whatever, and I'm sure it's got a very fascinating story. It wasn't until we just started talking to them, like, I realized I've never seen him talk about the movie. And I might have, like, when I was younger, but nothing I remember.
He doesn't frequently talk about what he's done. David Lynch is not famous for talking.
That's what I'm saying. No, exactly. And that's the thing is, I wish more directors would be that way sometimes. Right. I know we all want, like, instant gratification. We always want to know, like, well, I want to know what, like, but sometimes you just have to let art be art, man. Sometimes I
think that's our generation, though. We're the generation, we hit adulthood at the peak of the audio commentary era, which I think is really only going to belong to us. I don't think kids nowadays, to put it like an old man, I don't think they give a shit about the audio commentaries. It's part of why home video culture is dying, is because you're not going to get the audio commentary of something on Netflix, and nobody cares. But we Devin, got the only reason we got the peak of audio commentaries and DVD special features, and we may be 100%. The only generation that gets that.
And guys like you and I used to, I'm speaking for you, but I'm sure we used to buy DVDs and Blu-rays specifically because of those extra features. Like, this is an extra, and Devin, one of the reasons I enjoyed doing this podcast with you is not just because you're obviously I like your taste in cinema, or I'm always surprised, but obviously it's like because of how similar, like how much on the same page we are. I was just literally having the conversation about how I was pointing out to a coworker, and for people on this podcast, I work in the streaming entertainment field. We'll just leave it at that. But I was talking to a coworker about how the Disney Plus actually includes a ton of really great extras, and they'll include like behind the scenes stuff, making of, and sometimes even do some kind of commentary stuff. And they're like, they do, and I was like, yeah, like, and their reaction was like, who wants to see that? And I was like, I do. And I thought that was a thing, and I was like, no, people, it's never been a thing on Netflix or the major streaming platforms. So kids just, and again, I think there's so much media these days. Like, people don't have the time to invest. Like, I've listened to the One Crazy Summer audio commentary with Bobcat Goldthwait probably 20 times. I've seen it more with the audio commentary on than I've seen it without it, and I've seen that movie a lot. But that's just a thing of the past. Kids don't care. It's not like, so I agree 100%. I think it's our generation is the height of that, and I think like I said, I think it's gone the way of the dodo. So I'm super glad you said that, because I completely agree with you.
But to look at a bright side of it, that's what we have podcasts for. We are the ones who are going to keep alive all the information we learned from all of those documentaries and audio commentaries.
Exactly, 100%.
I am so full of fun facts. My wife is obsessed with getting me on a game show at some point. I keep telling you it's got to be a movie game show, or else I'm going to look like an idiot. But that's part of how I know all this stuff, and we're here to pass it on. Fun fact. Right. I mean, The Elephant Man was produced by Mel Brooks. Yep. It's good to know all these little things.
I love that Mel Brooks produced The Fly, and one of my favorite. I'm sure you already know this, but I'll just say it for the listeners. But when people heard that Mel Brooks was going to produce a remake of The Fly, the corny old Vincent Price got man turned into a fly movie, which is I love the Vincent Price one as well. I actually really love that the effects and makeup monster design in that movie. But people are like, oh, it's gonna be a silly little movie, and at the premiere they gave out little wobbly fucking fly antenna, and then they saw the movie and people were left fucking puking and tormented to their very soul. No, but I love that.
Proof positive a remake can actually be better.
Absolutely I say that all the time, and that again it also speaks to what a badass Mel Brooks is, and the fact that like he was a big supporter of like horror movies, and it wasn't just fucking Robin Hood Men in tights. How unfair is that? That's where I go with it. Fucking dude made some of the most amazing comedies of all time.
There is another movie that came out in 1980 that has man in the title, and it's not Superman 2, and it's not the Elephant Man. Do you know what it is?
I don't.
The Stunt Man.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Is that 1980?
1980, and it was nominated for a bunch of Oscars. How did that movie get nominated? I mean, not that it wasn't deserving. I think it's a great movie. But what made 1980 cool enough that it was acknowledged that was such a cool movie? Because that movie has cult written all over it. That movie was made for future appreciation.
Dude, that's crazy.
Stuntman was
Did I watch it with you?
For best, possibly, but it was nominated for Best Picture, I believe.
Was it really?
Yeah, it was nominated for Best Screenplay, Best Supporting Actor with Peter O'Toole. It was really fully recognized and then instantly hit cult status. But I don't know how it slipped into the mainstream.
I need to rewatch that.
I'd like
do
to
remember
see it again too.
Barbara Hershey's in that as well. It's funny because a lot of that period films, like I can say, like if I didn't first see it with you or with our good friend Casey, I definitely rewatched it with you or with Casey. So I feel like we definitely at this point, as we should probably wrap up. I don't know how much our listeners can stand us talking about the films in 1980, but I feel like we definitely need to talk. I mean, again, I could talk about Coal Miner's Daughter, one of my favorite movies. I think I love Sissy Spacek. I think she's probably my favorite actress of all time. What a great movie. I mean, and again, I love Loretta Lynn, and the fact that fucking Sissy Spacek did all the music for it is fucking incredible.
Tommy Lee Jones is great in it too.
Tommy Lee Jones is great.
I think it's the first time he was ever really on my radar. I'm not sure whether that came out first or Rolling Thunder, but
Rolling Thunder. We could talk about Rolling Thunder at some point too. Some point on this podcast. Definitely falls in line with my my vigilante films. But I feel like if we don't talk about Robert Altman's Popeye, I feel like we've done a disservice, because I know, Devin, you and I are a rare breed. I like to say that we are men of taste and culture. The fact that we can recognize that Robert Altman's Popeye is a fucking masterpiece, start to finish, with one of the greatest film soundtracks of all time. And if you don't agree with that, you can go kiss my grits. I did not have a strong ending for that. Pulled out the Mel's Diner.
It's a good 1980 reference, though.
Exactly. Thank you. I'm glad. You go.
You were keeping up with the times. But yeah, Popeye. It was the first soundtrack I ever owned. It was the first record I ever owned. That was mine. Did not belong to my parents. It was my Popeye record. I have a tattoo of Popeye on my arm that is more of a product of that movie than of the comic strip that it's drawn from. And it was watching Popeye when I was 3 years old that I decided I wanted to make movies. Popeye was a very important film to me. It still continues to be something that I watch about every year.
So one of the things, my mother passed away this year, and I realized at some point in my mid-20s, my dad was my hero growing up. I love my dad. Everybody who knew my dad loved my dad.
I love your dad.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Devin. And my dad was definitely a huge influence on me. But it struck me, in my mid to late 20s, the fact that really I am my mother's son.
I danced with your mother at your wedding, and it is one of the most memorable moments of my life.
I did not even know that. That's
and I will never forget. After your father passed away, this may be getting a little too personal. After your father passed away, I sent her a card telling her, my thoughts were with her and how lucky she was to have had three of the greatest people that I know as children with this man. And when she saw me at the funeral, I went to go give her a hug, and she looked like she was going to smack me. And she goes, "Devin, you're a son of a bitch. You made me cry." And I will love that forever. I will hold that as a memory in my heart for as long as I live. I love your
That's
folks.
Amazing. Yeah, that's the perfect Judy story anyway. That sums up with my mom.
It's a tangent. It has nothing to do with Popeye, but had to be said.
But I will tie it back, because, one thing, like, my mom I still remember to this day waking up super sick at like 3:00 in the morning, and my mom was in the kitchen on a little old black and white little mini TV watching The Flying Guillotine. My mom loved Godzilla movies, although she just like me is a Gamera fan, but she loved Godzilla movies. She loved Kung Fu movies. Weirdly, her two favorite movies growing up were Lethal Weapon and Tremors, which says a lot about the woman. But one thing she loved that really impacted me was she loved musicals, and she specifically loved really weird musicals. Case in point, she loved Popeye. It's one of those movies that, like, I saw it probably just like you. I didn't know all of the the stories of it and gotten, that's critical reception, whatever. I just remember seeing like, hey, it's Mork, and he's Popeye, and he's a fucking really good Popeye, and it's fucking my favorite Martian is Poop Deck, and he's fucking really good as Poop Deck.
It's
and
Ray Walston.
Right, exactly, and rest in peace. And then and his fucking whole cast is rest in peace.
Everybody but Shelley Duvall is rest in peace at this point.
Exactly. And then you have the only actress who has ever lived that could play fucking Olive Oil, which was Shelley Duvall, the most genius casting, start to finish. I cannot say enough of, like, she is so good in it. She's the perfect Olive Oil. She physically looks like Olive Oil. She looks like the cartoon come to life. But even beyond that, she captures the essence of Olive Oil. Like, that's sort of like, even the voice, she's so fucking good. Anyways.
If anybody was ever born to play a role. And that's, even people that don't like that movie will say, oh, but Shelley Duvall as Olive Oil.
Perfect. Yeah, what a fucking, I mean, again, I think we've already mentioned this on this podcast once, which is saying something, but Harry Nilsson is one of my favorite songwriters of all time. I know he's big to you. I still remember me and my brother sitting on a porch outside, just literally listening to Harry Nilsson. You put on his, I don't know if it was his greatest hits or whatever, and just listening to song after song of, I mean, one of the most heartbreaking. Anyways, Harry Nilsson's a goddamn genius. If you don't know Harry Nilsson, look him up. He actually has a really interesting documentary about him too. The soundtrack is so good. The music is so fun. The sets are great. Everything about it is, I think, is such an accomplishment. And by Robert Altman, like I said, who's wasn't known for doing adaptations of cartoons. One of the greatest American filmmakers of all time, in my opinion. Definitely one of the most original and unique filmmakers. But I think it works on every level. And every time it gets brought up as a shitty movie, blows my mind that people can't see its worth.
Well, because people don't understand it. Even at the time, I think it was Robert Evans who produced it, had pointed out that basically we asked for a Popeye movie and he delivered a Robert Altman movie. For people who don't know Altman's style, when he's at his best, anyways, he was dealing with ensemble casts, and he liked to mic everybody in the room. And some of his movies, famously, stuff like Nashville, he would have cameras out in the set, and people wouldn't even know if they were in the movie or not. They didn't know if they were recording a moment that was going to come up. They had to improvise the conversation at a party or a gathering of some kind. They had to basically build their characters themselves. Not that there weren't screenplays for these, but he really wanted to go kind of loosey-goosey with that approach. And it works really well for stuff like Nashville. Works a little less for something like, say, Long Goodbye, which was a little bit more structured and also a masterpiece.
Yep.
He's not necessarily going to do that with Popeye, but the improvisation. But he did do the ensemble cast, and it's not just about Popeye, it's about this town, Sweet Haven. And original versions of the script did have some of the more outlandish characters in it. There is a version of the script that had the Sea Hag and the Goon and Jeep, who all root back to the original comic strip. When I was growing up, I think I thought of Jeep as kind of being like Scrappy Doo, like this weird annoying addition that came with the later incarnation of the cartoon. But no, Jeep actually had his start back in the comics.
Comic strip.
Yes.
People don't understand what a weird fucking comic strip that shit was, anyways.
Popeye was weird. Weird
as shit.
And his whole approach to this movie was, let's take a sailor who is going to basically be coming out of the real world and entering this cartoon community. And Popeye becomes more of a cartoon as the movie goes along. Now, he has the big arms from the beginning. So that's one thing. But you watch that movie, it's a progression of Popeye becoming a townsperson, of him becoming a cartoon. And everybody that's in the background, they were all made up of there were some great actors there, some great extras, but a lot of the extras were trained circus performers, and you will see them performing stunts in the background and acrobats and things. There's old silent movie tricks that are going on in the background. So if you're watching that movie, you really need to keep your eyes open for every corner of the screen. Something's going on. And then if you look at the old comic strips from the I want to say 30s, down to the details of what the Oil family's sofa looked like, it's in the movie. So he's really actually being quite faithful to the original source material. But at that point, Popeye was more known as a cartoon and not as a comic strip.
A comic strip, yep.
And it was really based on the comic strip, and it was done in an Altman way. And so people didn't know quite what to make of it. I think it should be appreciated as a classic now. And I think primarily it is, but it still has its detractors, and I don't get it.
And well, it's funny because I do think a lot of the detractors are people like a little bit, maybe a generation older than us, who kind of, when it came out, it was known as a commercial flop and an artistic flop. Those people people are wrong, but that's fine. Everybody's entitled to be wrong. One thing, though, I always notice about it, just as a fan, is all of the shoes and all of the legs are literally exactly like the comic strip drawings. These sort of weird, like, balloony, bulbous shoe and this sort of, like, exaggerated bell-bottomy kind of, like, that. And I'm blank. I used to, as a cartoonist and as an artist, I grew up. I loved comics and comic strips. I had a weakness for Dick Tracy as a kid. I still remember checking out a book about how to draw Dick Tracy characters, and it's really formative to me. But I also remember this big collection of the old E.C. Seeger Popeye comic strips, and again, like, great drawing. Like, it is very unique style. Had, like, which, you know, I think is you know, the really great characters from two-dimensional mediums, comics or comic strips. Like, the artist has to have a distinct vision that sets it apart, and E.C. Seeger was definitely one that, you know, definitely had that quality. He had very unique individual style. His characters all had, like, their own sort of anatomy and their own, like, his line work was really interesting. But anyways, but yeah, it's one of my favorite movies that I feel like doesn't, you know, always get the love it deserves. And again, it's the perfect storm for me because I love musicals, I love Popeye, and I love Robert Altman. Weirdly, not the biggest Robin Williams fan of Robin Williams comedies. This gets very contentious, but I'm not a fan of most of. I'm not a big fan of Miss Doubtfire. Not a big Miss Doubtfire fan. Not a big Aladdin fan. I think sometimes his comedy is so over the top and so, like, it becomes almost obnoxious and annoying to me. I know that's not a popular opinion. I can say I actually, I'm glad. Of course you do, because we're so on the same page, Devin. But I did get to sort of meet the man in person. He was he actually he bought some artwork from a friend and old coworker of mine.
Wow.
At the White Walls Gallery in San Francisco. And he was such a quiet, really genuinely sweet guy. And he had conversation. And of course, you know, even in some places cool as like a super hipster art gallery in San Francisco, of course he was going to have people approaching him, and he couldn't have been more civil and nice to everybody who approached him. So, you know, rest in peace, Robin. Like I said, and again, but I always enjoyed his like his dramatic films. Usually a much bigger fan of, but
I have a long list of stuff that I love, but they aren't necessarily his most beloved.
Yeah, no, and that's again same. A lot of like you know,
Garp is fantastic.
I don't know, is Fisher King like a well-loved movie? I don't even know.
It wasn't its day, but I never hear anybody talk about it anymore, and I love Fisher King.
Yeah, it's one of those.
That's one we should do a Terry Gilliam episode.
I'm down with that too. There's a lot of Devin. I have a feeling we're going to be doing this podcast for a while, so we'll definitely get to. I mean, there's tons to talk about, but you know, at this point, I think we've gone on
longer than 1980.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Was there any films or anything you want to wrap up about the 1980 year in cinema?
I love to throw out kind of unrecognized classics, so I'm just going to put this one out there if anyone gets a chance to see it. Hopscotch. It's on the Criterion Channel. It's one of my favorite movies of 1980 that nobody talks about. It involves Walter Matthau at his most Matthauiest. That was a mouthful. He's a CIA agent. So if you can imagine Walter Matthau playing the smartest CIA agent, he's now outfoxing his own CIA throughout the movie. He's kind of being forced into retirement. So he decides to publish a book with all of the information that he knows, and he's completely fucking with his new boss who pushed him out, who's played by Ned Beatty. It is just so funny. It's so dry, impeccably written. He probably should have been nominated for an Oscar that year. The script definitely should have been nominated. It's hard to say something's undiscovered if there's a Criterion collection, but if you have not seen it, check out Hopscotch. It is on the Criterion Channel currently, and you will appreciate yourself for it.
Well, that's the thing is, again, one of the other reasons I love doing this is because, you know, inevitably you're going to bring up a movie that I haven't seen that I know I need to see. So, and thankfully I'm an annual subscriber. We when paid for the full year to advance for Criterion, the Criterion Channel, which I feel like is it's a must if you can afford it. But anyways, Devin, like always, this was really fun. I feel like we touched upon at least the majority of films that I feel like need to be brought up.
Most of them. I think we could do a round two on this, but
oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's Little Darling. Like I said, I grew up at a time when Blue Lagoon was on TV every 3 days on Channel 13, so I never needed to see it again. It's an interesting movie, but yeah, this has been really fun. I definitely look forward to more of these, talking about like a full year in cinema. I think we started off with a bang. Again, 1980. There's specific years in cinema for me. As far as like I feel like are like, oh yeah, let's talk about 84, and there's a
It was a milestone year.
But goddamn, is it? Yeah. So it's Devin. Till next time. I've been. I'll be looking forward to the next time we did talk.
Always looking forward to it too.
All right. Well. All right, guys. Well, thanks for listening. Like and subscribe where available. We'll try to get some sort of social media presence at some point if you enjoy this podcast, and that way you can tell us how much you disagree and how much Popeye actually sucks, or how much you feel like Ordinary People truly deserve that Oscar nomination. But anyways, until next time, I'm James. That is Devin, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.